Hi, and welcome to another lecture by the Political Theory Associate of IAPSS. Today, Ruben is presenting. Ruben is a master's degree candidate at the University of Free State, and the topic is Neopatrimonialism in Sub-Saharan Africa. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Afternoon, everyone. I hope you guys are having a lovely Saturday. The concept of Neopatrimonialism is actually something that I stumbled upon by mistake. Or not by mistake, but by chance, rather. So I'd like to take you guys through my thought process and what led me to the concept of Neopatrimonialism. Firstly, I'd also like to thank you, IAPSS, for the opportunity to talk, and Erin for organizing everything. Brilliant job. Thanks. So let me just quickly go back. So the background is that historically, post-colonial African states have faced two major obstacles, which is democratic consolidation and economic development. So that according to contemporary analysis, African states are currently fully entrenched in a period of democratic backsliding. So when we measure the quality of democratic governance and the respect for basic human rights, Sub-Saharan Africa contributes significantly to the global democratic recession, which has continued for 14 years. So globally, for 14 years, the respect for basic human rights as well as democratic governance has been in a recession. In total, 22 African countries suffered score declines, with 7 of the 12 largest declines in democracy and net freedom globally transpiring in the Sub-Saharan region. Only 9% of Sub-Saharan African population and 14% of its countries are categorized as free, with 52% of its population and 49% of its countries partly free, while a staggering 39% of its population and 37% of its countries are classified as not free. So also, despite a 35% increase in the Human Development Index in the last 2 decades, the region as a whole has failed to escape the low human development category into the medium human development category, while also 90% of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, or should I rather say 90% of the countries that are ranked in the low human development category are situated within Sub-Saharan Africa. So also within the last 2 decades, the Political Stability Index marks a 23% decrease in the region's average score. So based on all of these facts, and I should rather say negative image Africa portrays towards the outside, I started actually investigate the concept of African statehood and why it's currently not functioning optimally. Because in my head, obviously, Asian tigers have a different model, and China as well. But I mean, democracies should probably be one of the most efficient models, as liberal democracies have shown, for economic development. The whole point of democracy is to get the right people at the top, and which they would then make the right decisions. So this graph then builds upon the previous stats, which just shows that from 2009 to 2019, if we take the year 2019, 22 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa has suffered score declines from Freedom House. We can see that the most notable declines are in Benin, Mozambique, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Nigeria. While I'd just like to point out Sudan and Ethiopia and the DRC has improved in their scores, they are by no means free per se. It's just that they are less free. This is just a map to show that how Freedom House has categorized the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa specifically. It divides them into 3 categories: free, partly free, and not free. And as we can see, countries such as Senegal and Benin has suffered very, very bad score declines. This is just the same graph illustrating the stats. So then if you go to state failure, only 2 sub-Saharan countries, Mauritius and Botswana, are currently ranked as stable, with the rest having already failed. So if we can look at countries like Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Somalia, or the fragile states at risk of failing, such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and Cameroon. And also, Mauritius serves as the region's only full democracy, which also then the region includes 6 flawed democracies, 14 hybrid regimes, and 23 authoritarian regimes. So this is really a bad image post-colonial Africa is showing us, and it's not what we wanted for the post-colonial period. So then these democracies are not consolidating. If we then look at democratic consolidation, Cheeseman states that countries democratically consolidate through 2 interdependent processes. First, states must mature their democracies by developing and reinforcing democratic institutions that function independent of the executive. In South Africa, for example, we have 6 such institutions, which are the Public Protector, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities. Also, we have the Commission of Gender Equality, the Auditor General, and the Electoral Commission. So these 6 institutions then function independent of the executive, which shows some progress towards democratically consolidating. Also, the second interdependent process then is democratic advancements within the institutional structures of the state need to be protected through sustained growth and development of democratic norms, practices, procedures within political institutions, political parties, and society at large. We go further, just to give you some background, this is where I'm coming from in my thought process and how I got to the topic of patrimonialism. So Fukuyama then also has his opinion on democratic consolidation, which is quite close to what I argue. He believes that it's an amalgamation of 3 institutions. Firstly, it's the state, which he defines, or which is defined in the Western political science as a continuously operated political organization with an administrative staff that aims at successfully upholding a monopoly over the legitimate use of coercion within a delineated territory. We can see that this is quite clearly a Westphalian definition of the state. The rule of law is the second institution, which is a compilation of rules that are binding upon all those who deal or reside within a specific delineated territory. Democratic accountability then is this third institution, which operates on the behalf of entire citizenry to ensure that governments act in the best interest of all and not simply in the self-interest of those who govern. So some sort of combination or cohesion between these 3 institutions results in a progression into democratic consolidation. If we take a look at this graph then, when the cost of repression or coups, as it's also known, is low, the rich always are willing to undertake repression or coups to overthrow the government. As the cost of the coups rise, inequality must be sufficiently high for a coup to be worthwhile. So in other words, the more expensive it becomes to overthrow a democracy, expensive in terms of financial resources, expensive as well in terms of how your image will be negatively portrayed within the Western world, which is they are very antagonistic towards coups, the less likely it becomes for the elite to attempt a coup. So in an ideal world, in sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of repression should be very high. Foreign government should step in with sanctions or even hell very close if they have direct interference. But I mean, some sort of cost should be accompanied with repressing your country's citizens In Africa, we see that as the cost of repression decreases, more and more people are willing to take chances. They are willing to slip further into the authoritarian regime type. Fukuyama, democratic consolidation then also relies entirely on the civil society's trust and perception that the source of authority of the state governing them is legitimate. So this is a very powerful statement. What is important to note is that there's a distinction being made between the legitimate and illegitimate authority. Legitimate authority then is coercive power endorsed and voluntarily complied to by a state's citizens. Illegitimate authority lacks the element of voluntary compliance and instead continues to rely on coercion, similar to the colonial situation. So if we look at legitimate authority, Hobbes comes to mind with his Leviathan, also some social contractionists such as Rousseau, which then means that the citizens are willingly complying to the state's coercion. The idea of voluntary compliance relies on a belief in the existing legitimacy within the governing authority. Max Weber, most famously, is the most prominent scholar to delve into the idea of legitimate authority. He then goes on to describe three types, ideal types, should I say, of legitimate authority, which firstly is the rational legal model. It draws its source of legitimacy from the legally established impersonal order, resting on the rules, rights inherent in a state's legal system. This is typically a state we see in the Western world, Europe, North America, and so on. Traditional authority is also another legitimate source. It's granted and sometimes even inherited from the values, norms, beliefs, and customs of the society in question. We find this type of traditional authority we find in pre-colonial Africa. We also find it in tribes in should I say, settled America. Also before the Spanish found South America, you also find a very strong traditional authority, which doesn't mean that the authority is not legitimate, since it's still viewed by its citizens as legitimate, and it draws a source of legitimacy from a different model than the Western model, which is more rational legal. The last one, charismatic authority, rests on the devotion to the exceptional sanctity, heroism, or exemplary character of an individual person. This would more little drive into the a religious authority, perhaps, or someone that has a very, very strong personality type, which draws authority from his personality type, and people adhere to his authority. Patrimonial states then rely on traditional authority for their government's legitimacy, since there's no distinction between the property of the interest of the public and that of the entity that governs. These states are referred to as patrimonial states, characterized primarily by bureaucracy saturated with intimate clientage type relationships. On the contrary, modern liberal democratic statehood relies on an established and impersonal legal bureaucratic framework as its source of legitimacy. However, in South Africa, we find that the nearly 500-year colonial history blurs these lines between the authentic and legitimate African traditional authority ideal types and the colonially enforced bureaucratic institutions of authority that became mainstream and to some extent pseudo-traditional. Neo-patrimonialism then we find as a collision between this pre-existing patrimonial form of political organization and the colonial state. This symbiotic relationship between the pre-colonial forms of African authority and the colonial state's modern structures cultivate the new patrimonial state, which is then a state with the external appearance of a modern state, yet it possesses the internal reality of personal rule. Consequently, the amalgamation of these two systems create the perfect environment for corruption and the abuse of power fueled by a section of the population with a claim on the executive or the executive branch. It is argued that Neopatrimonialism is the central and core feature of African politics, which we see post-colonially. Of course, African states derive their international legitimacy from being seen as modern legal bureaucratic states. However, internally, as we experience it on the ground, and many academics have tried to explain, these post-colonial African states, actually, the reality is different. This Venn diagram just illustrates the ideal types of rational legal authority on the left, traditional authority on the right, which then amalgamate into the Neopatrimonial authority, which is a type of political domination predicated on personalistic patterns of authority and the exploitation of public resources for private social, political, and economic gain, which is very important because the whole point of capturing the executive branch is that whoever controls the executive branch in government could then control the public resources. Within the ideal type of patrimonial domination, the entire state apparatus and all of its social, political, and economic institutions are appropriated for private advantages. Weber conceptualizes a patrimonial bureaucracy as a hierarchical organization with an impersonal sphere of competence, occupied by unfree officials, who, however, function in a formally bureaucratic manner. I'll just jump to the last point here. So, the Weber's distinction between a free and an unfree individual then is that an unfree individual has some sort of obligation above and beyond his official office, whereas in a modern bureaucracy, the principle of appointment is on technical qualifications and the officials are free, which means that they are only bound to their bureaucratic position insofar as it is a position held on technical qualifications and it's a job. I mean, you don't really owe your boss any loyalty above and beyond that he's your boss, where in Weber's conception of an unfree individual, some public official that got a position due to patrimonial practices would have to afford his superiors loyalty above and beyond his official position. Patrimonial officials do not hold the corresponding technical qualifications for the positions that they occupy, and they are somewhat unfree and that they are subject to, as I explained, to the authority of the organization or their superiors above and beyond the professional obligation of their office. They are appointed on the basis of traditional ties of loyalty. In return for their continued loyalty and service, they receive a patrimonial retainer, which can also be seen as living from the Lord's table. Here we have an example of in South Africa, we have Minister Fikile Mbalula. He was elected president of the ANC Youth League in August 2004. In the ANC's apartheid struggles, he was a very, very powerful figure, which then, as you can see, he got the position of ANC Youth League president. In President Jacob Zuma's cabinet, Mbalula was first appointed as Deputy Minister of Police. Later, Zuma reshuffled his cabinet and Mbalula became Minister of Sports, Recreation, and then later on they reshuffled again and he was appointed Minister of Police. Cyril Ramaphosa came along, which is the new president of South Africa, and he made Mbalula Minister of Transport. So here we have a man, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, who's held 3 different cabinet positions, namely he was the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Police, as well as Minister of Sports and Recreation, while he himself only has a bachelor's degree in economics. He's never been a policeman in his life. He's never served in any police force. He's never played any sports in his life. And he certainly doesn't know, he's not a civil engineer. He doesn't know a lot about the transport industry. However, due to his patrimonial or traditional ties to the governing party, the ANC, Mr. Balula has been kept in power as a minister and just shuffled around, as we can see. So patrimonialism academically has been applied in 4 different distinct ways. The first concept, it's used to characterize a network of social relations mediated by personal loyalty and governed by bonds of dependence and subordination at the state, sub-state, or community level. We see that in William Murphy, which applies this conceptualization to patron-client relationships that developed and evolved into administrative networks in the Liberian and Sierra Leonean civil wars in the late 80s and 90s, specifically in instances of youth mobilization by military big men. So in this example, the short youth with no future in front of them except poverty was swept up by these big men in the civil war, promised some tithe or some plunder in exchange for protection from other bands of groups. Also, Jean-François Medard applies this concept of Neopatrimonialism to illuminate historical patron-client relationships in what he refers to as traditional clientist states of Rwanda and Burundi. The second is that Neopatrimonialism builds upon the first and is applied to describe the rent-seeking behavior and personalist patterns of authority practiced by African leaders in select country settings. In particular, it is used more deliberately to describe the behavior and pattern of authority established by a particular national leader and their followers after independence. Bayard applies this conceptualization to Western Africa, where he talks about politics of the belly, a Cameroonian metaphor which he utilizes to denote a mode of government and a framework of unequal exchange of goods. So in Bayard's famous book, Africa, The State in Africa, he describes the politics of the belly being that whoever is on top see their position as a way to illustrate that it's our time to eat now. We made it. So the president, his loyalists, they choose sides depending on who make it to the top. Because if your faction gets to the top, it's your time to eat. Politics of the belly. The third way also, it's used to delineate an economic logic, distinguished by the continual blurring of the public and private gain, with serious implications for economic development. Theobald identifies 3 sets of variables in this application of Neopatrimonialism, which is a country's economic characteristics such as GDP and the national budget, a country's political characteristics such as state structures and historic evolution, and bureaucratic typologies. Most, if not all, utilizations of Neopatrimonialism incorporate some form of operational understanding that it involves an economic logic. So it's important to note here that there's a continual blurring between the public and the private spheres. Okay. Finally, the concept of Neopatrimonialism also used to define a characteristic type of regime associated with African countries. Breton and van der Waal employ this perception that Neopatrimonialism is an institutionalized regime. Just to summarize this quite academic section on Neopatrimonialism is that Neopatrimonialism is a type of political domination that oscillates between the 2 ideal types of rational legal and patrimonial or traditional rule. This oscillating political domination is predicated on a personalist pattern of authority and the exploitation of public resources for private gain, also economic gain. This political domination and economic logic is administered by the political elites and is enforced and upheld by a network of social relations mediated by personal loyalty. Patrimonialism involves a legal subtype of political domination where every state institution is appropriated by the ruler or the ruling class for private economic gain. The appropriate state institutions then are administered by clients, who in turn are appointed by virtue of loyalty and personal ties. Due to their appointment based on loyalty and personal ties, these clients owe their loyalty to the ruler or ruling class above and beyond their official office, and in return, they receive their share of the ruler or ruling class's appropriated social, political, and economic advantage. This model of new patrimonialism is very interesting to me because it allows us to view the corruption and current state of African affairs not in a way that we can argue, as has been argued, that Africans are backward, African countries are backwards, they're barbaric, and so on and so forth. Actually, that this allows us to employ a rational actor model in which the political instrumentalization of disorder by political elites is also where political actors in Africa seek to maximize the return of the state of confusion, uncertainty, and sometimes even chaos, which characterizes most African polities. As also is commonly argued that Africa that is not working is working for someone. Someone is making a lot of money. Someone is becoming very powerful within this state of confusion. This model's argument is that, in fact, it is the African political elites. By also saying that Chabal and Deleuze also argue that they make it explicitly clear they are not referring to irrationality. On the contrary, they argue that the inhabitants of Africa are no less rational than those found elsewhere, and as such, the issue of new patrimonialism cannot be attributed to backwardness, as I've argued just now, but instead deserves to be treated with the same theoretical rigor that one would afford any other Western political issue. As such, when they refer to new patrimonialist African states as disorderly, they express the sentiment that African polities operate predominantly on a set of informal, uncodified, and unpoliced principles, contrary to those political realities in impersonal bureaucratic states. So this is where we find the contrast between African states, especially post-colonial sub-Saharan states, and perhaps the ideal type of rational legal state, also perhaps more closely to the ideal type we find the states in Europe and Western, the Western sphere, which aspire to also operate on this impersonal bureaucratic order. However, in Africa, we find that there are the rules and then there are the real rules. There are the informal, uncodified, unpoliced principles. This brings into issue African statehood. The argument then is that the presence of new patrimonial statehood in sub-Saharan Africa overtly hinders the process of democratic consolidation and economic development. The fundamental flaw in contemporary developing countries is that is a failure to construct, organize, and establish modern states. However, the concept of the state has never truly been emancipated from African society. We see this a lot in rural Africa as well, where the idea that there exists some sort of entity as the state, which is completely emancipated from society, operates on its own. It doesn't matter who's president. The president is just like a new driver of the car. The car doesn't belong to anyone. However, the car functions, the car operates the country. We find very, very difficult to emancipate this idea of the state from African society. Especially the Westphalian state that we see Chabal and Deleuze argue that above and beyond a monopoly over legitimate coercion, it entails the existence of a truly independent bureaucracy emancipated from civil society that functions uninhibited from clientelist pressures. This emancipation and institutionalization of the state bureaucracy effectively divorces the public and private sphere. So this is the issue in a lot of African countries, where we find military big men, we find very corrupt elite politicians, families, loyalists. The public and private spheres haven't been divorced yet. The idea that the public sphere could function independently of the private sphere, or that it in fact should function independently of the private sphere, is foreign to them. However, it's not in their best interest of the African political elites to institutionalize and emancipate state bureaucracy, since from their position, its usefulness is greatest when it is least institutionalized. To these political elites, patrons, or big men, as they are commonly referred to, the notion that they should be public servants is irrational, and instead the obligation lie primarily with their clients. As such, the legitimacy of African political elites derives from their ability to nourish their clientele on which the power rests, and not on the impersonal bureaucratic instruments of a modern state. The argument is that it's the necessary resources that these African political elites require to nourish their clientele can be found in the weak institutions of neo-patrimonial states. If we think of these neo-patrimonial networks in terms of the picture we see here, the money would flow from the top down and loyalty would flow from the bottom up. So then these African political elites, which we see the guy on the top with the halo around his head, they wouldn't actually rely on state bureaucracy, democratic elections, all of these Western ideals for their legitimacy or for them to rule, that actually rely on this network of loyalists beneath them. These loyalists are more than happy to forego their democratic rights or their right to a free vote in return for some economic gain. So it's clear here that there's an economic logic which operates from the top down and the bottom up. Additionally, the issues raised of Africa's imported statehood, this idea that the public sphere should be completely separated from the private sphere, that African states have inherited, and they have inherited these institutional structures of statehood from their colonial past. However, they've failed to uphold authority and power that accompanied the colonial conceptualization of the state. Neo-patrimonial tendencies in post-colonial African states originate from illegitimate post-colonial statehood. What is done here by Engelbert is that he strengthens the claim that neo-patrimonialism has its roots in colonialism and brings into question the ideals of Western statehood and its applicability in Africa's post-colonial political and social reality. Thank you. That is my presentation. I would just like to thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for presenting the concept. I think Greece as a country relocated to Africa from what I'm hearing about neo-patrimonialism as a concept.
What's interesting is that a lot of the idea that neo-patrimonialism is unique to Africa is not what I'm trying to portray here. We also find neo-patrimonial practices throughout the world, especially countries that have been colonized, like in South America and even sometimes in Europe. However, in Africa, we often find that is the central feature of what's going on in the States. For example, countries such as the United States were also neo-patrimonial some time ago. However, they've progressed. They've, I think in 1888, they introduced the Pendleton Act, which argued for entrance exams based on technical qualifications to hold official positions, where in Africa you see Like I showed you the example of Minister Fikile, he goes from Minister of Sport to Minister of Transport to Minister of Police in the span of a decade, having no technical qualifications. So yeah, I think we find this everywhere, but I think it's got a particularly strong flavor in Africa.
That was very, very interesting. Thank you so much both for the theory on it and for the real life examples. I do have some questions, but maybe someone else would like to go first. You can either turn your mic on, or you could type your question on the chat. I don't see anything coming up, so I can ask something. I thought that as you presented as well at some point, the concept is so close and similar to the patron, you know, and the client concept. And you know, it is what it is. It's bleak, it sucks, it seems to have no end in sight, but okay, in the end, sure, we have pinpointed the problem and we can recognize it, and we realize it sucks. And what do you do after realizing that this is how things work, and you give it a name, you set it up as a theory? Do you see an end in sight? I don't know if that question makes any sense. Like, we know the problem exists and we know how it came to be and how it unfolds. Okay, how are we dealing with it? Can we deal with it?
I think we should be very, very cautious when subscribing solutions to complex problems like the one we face here. However, I do believe that it's not possible to completely eradicate patron-client relationships from political science, in theory or in practice. We see that all around the world. We see it everywhere, from ground root to right to the top. However, I think we can definitely progress to a time and space where it's not decimating a country or subcontinent's economic advantages it has. So we see, for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the minerals are being sold by African elites, which pocket immensely, but I mean, the population work as slaves in the mines. So having a patron-client relationship there where elites rely on military big men to enforce the mining of of minerals such as cobalt and diamonds, I think it's tremendous. It's very much worse than perhaps a politician in the US or in, for example, Greece, making his son some president of a university somewhere. I do believe that through institutionalizing democratic structures in countries, we could minimize the effects of this.
Bob, you want to ask something?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your presentation, Ruben. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on something. A lot of the time, they're like, counters, stating that, these patron-client networks are, necessary in making sure that whatever is accumulated at the top eventually finds its way to indigenous communities and people who rely on, the state to, provide scarce resources for them. But how realistic do you think that argument is, especially when looking at South Africa?
I think it's very dangerous to look at it that way, because that is exactly the patron-client relationships that this concept relies on. In South Africa, for example, we find that the ANC has a very, very strong supporter base, very strong loyalists that seem to never disappear. I mean, the ANC can do whatever they want, and they'll still have 50% of the country's votes. So I think this is an ideal situation where we can see the separation of the public and private sphere, which has not completely transpired in Africa, where indigenous communities and also previously disadvantaged communities, poor people, people that don't have healthcare and so on, should stop relying on patron-client relationships. They should stop relying on the political party to provide them with solutions, but instead they should see this as a function of the public sphere, a function of the state as an entity and not the party as an entity. We find this all throughout Africa, that more often than not, functions of independent bureaucratic state it gets confused with the function of a party, a political party. In Zimbabwe, we have got ZANU-PF handing out farms to ZANU-PF. I mean, the redistribution of wealth shouldn't be a function of any political party per se. It should be a function of the state bureaucratic entity, the public sphere. So I think we really find this problem in Africa, that the public and private spheres have not completely been emancipated from each other. Functions of the state should not be seen as relying on the political party, whereas social grants, for example, in South Africa, they won't go away, even if another political party such as the DA or perhaps the EFF comes into power. Certain state institutions will remain. I mean, the ambulances will still continue to pick up people. The police will still continue policing. The traffic police will still continue providing, writing people speeding tickets. It's not the ANC providing people with these services, it's the state.
Is that a legacy hound, or would you like to follow up on the question? Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to ask anything?
I really hope the presentation made sense. I mean, it was a bit theoretical, but I think it's a very pressing issue we experience in Africa at the moment.
It definitely did, and I think the theoretical framework was necessary. Also for reference, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just about to like agree with you. I think the use of like the theoretical framework and just explaining it in the way that you did, Ruben, kind of like put a really good perspective on it, you know, not just for like Sub-Saharan Africa, but like you said, other, you know, countries who have, you know, experienced oppression, going through the same type of, you know, struggles in terms of like these patron-client networks, in terms of like, you know, the equal distribution of wealth and of state resources not being a reality for impoverished communities. So yeah, it made a lot of sense, definitely.
I would like to ask something. Maybe it's more of a clarification, to be honest, because I didn't get something while you were presenting, and you mentioned it again while answering the question. You mentioned something about coups in the state, about a change in the administration, you know, and how the elites will only support a coup when it's convenient to them, but also inexpensive. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I want, maybe you could link that to the example that you gave. Was it about Congo and the mines that the elites are profiting from while the people work, well, while the people are treated like slaves?
What I can to perhaps also draw this concept of to more universal trend, where if I can just perhaps go back to that slide, we just see we find that, in my opinion, it's also what happens in Russia at the moment, the situation in Ukraine. So Russia in 2014 invades Crimea with little green men, and apparently the Crimean people greeted them with open arms, threw them with roses as they marched into the area. The response from the West wasn't satisfactory. So from a Russian point of view, it was a very, very inexpensive coup. It was, because essentially that's what it was. They couped the whole area. One day it was Ukraine, the next it was Russia. From the Russian point of view, this was very, very inexpensive. I mean, there weren't a lot of military casualties. Economically, it wasn't that expensive. The response from the UN, I mean, you can condemn something, but actually doing something about it is different. So the response from the rest of the world wasn't to such an extent that Russia thought, well, shucks, maybe we should not have done that. And on the basis of that, they invaded Ukraine further. They said that, well, if it's going to be so inexpensive to take a country, I mean, their reputation took a little bit of a blow, but not that much. Economically, they gained the ports, the seaports. So I hope you understand what I'm saying. So in African countries, we also see this, that if the cost of repression, so the price elites, African elites, or wherever you find them in the world, the price they have to pay to suppress their government, their civilians, when it's high, they are likely to reform. When it's very low, they'll just stay the same. If you have perhaps take a look at apartheid South Africa, eventually they were overcome by economic sanctions from the rest of the world, the apartheid government. The price of repression was so high that they couldn't afford it anymore. So as soon as the price of repression increases, it becomes more and more expensive to continue doing so, or to even do it again. I hope I answered your question.
You did, but now I have a follow-up.
You go ahead.
I was wondering what the role of external players might be in this concept, in maintaining those kind of those relations. For example, when talking about who cooperates with the government and with the elites, and who's imposing or not imposing sanctions, who's helping and who's not. What do you believe is the role of the international community in maintaining the current state of affairs? And let's start with what you believe is the role of the international community in this state of affairs.
Honestly, I believe they entirely complicit. I mean, the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa is in the situation that it is completely to the benefit of the rest of the world. If I can use South Africa as an example, in the poultry industry, for example, countries such as the United States are dumping frozen chicken in South Africa at a price that is not competitive to South African farmers. So, for instance, myself, if I was a South African farmer, a poultry farmer, I would not be able to produce a pound of poultry at a competitively priced area as we can import it from the US. I believe in West Africa as well. France is dumping large amounts of dairy products in Western Africa, so much so that Western Africa can't even develop a dairy industry. So an agricultural revolution in Africa is very unlikely to happen because of these dumping practices. So the international community is entirely complicit. I mean, I wouldn't say interest. Let me rather say this: interest groups are entirely complicit. How could they not be? Sub-Saharan Africa is in the situation that it is because of external actors. While on the ground level, a large portion of the population would take accountability and say that we are in the situation that we are and we have to do something about it. But the people with the actual power to do something about it are in cooperation with foreign powers, which would tend to not like it that much that Sub-Saharan Africa could develop economically, agriculturally, even socially. I think even also, if I could use another example of South Africa, I remember, if I remember correctly, the apartheid government had 6 nuclear weapons, which they developed. And post-independence, one of the United States demands were that these nuclear weapons were supposed to be destroyed. They cannot be trusted in the hands of an African government. Why not? Why should foreign powers have nuclear weapons, such as Israel, the United States, France, and militarily African countries are not capable of? I really believe that foreign powers, whether it be international organizations or whatever, are complicit in the situation. They are empowering. I would say that definitely African political elites are profiting from this, but they are empowered by foreign actors. I mean, they have to have a market for their products.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, Ruben, how I wasn't there for your presentation, but owing to Erin's question on what the international community can do and the nature of the topic on Neopatrimonialism in Africa, I want us to think about it in another way, right? Let's take the case of Libya, for example. What do you find in the destruction of Libya, by not just the citizens of Libya, but by international forces, international incursion in Libya? The fact there is that we must recognize that not only African states, but states across the world are legitimized by patron-client relations. And that is very strong that was very strong under Gaddafi in Libya. So the extent to which legitimacy, democracy, or whatever you might call it, was maintained in Libya, though people might say, no, Libya was not a democracy, it was an authoritarian state, we might agree with that. But the governance structure of Libya was then more legitimized by Neopatrimonialism, to an extent where it was not necessarily dangerous because Libya was a relatively prosperous state. But Western understanding of the state in Africa was totally thwarted, totally depraved. So when they thought about sanctions on Libya, they talk about no-fly zone over Libya. They supported armed groups in Libya and the rest of it. I think what can be done by the international community is simply this: stay out of African affairs. Stay out of, do not determine what is democracy or what is not democracy for Africa. No external power has a right to have like a sort of structure on how people should understand or how governance should be. African states should determine for themselves how they cooperate, how they run their individual countries. And that's what works in Europe, for example, France, Britain, Greece, whatever the case is. What works there cannot equally work in Africa. And even what works in one African state cannot work in another African state. So there's the entire warped understanding of how the democracy is and how governance should be and how our understanding of governance should be is totally wrong. So if the international community wants to help Africa, it should be a mutual relationship where we respect one another, we respect governance we respect your governance structure. We allow you to do what you can do rather than influencing and trying to manipulate you just because we have external interests. because the state is protected by these relations. And the thing about it, what Obama himself, as president of the U.S., made a very terrible mistake when he thought that the only way to get done with the entire state in Libya is to just get rid of Gaddafi. He did not even understand the very statehood of Libya and how governance work in Libya. Take, for example, Libya today. It's totally a failed state. There can be no legitimate government in Libya, because the traditional network that ensured legitimacy in Libya was totally dismantled by Western incursion. Their failure and overthinking on Neo-patrimonialism, what understanding of it totally destroyed Libya. So I think that is another way. Just stay out of African business and just allow them to run what they can and operate as cooperative partners.
I think you're entirely correct. If I can just direct you to this slide on the screen right now, it's regarding the legitimate authority. It's the idea of voluntary compliance. The idea that legitimate governments rely on voluntary compliance. So the ideal types, which I explained earlier, rational legal authority, traditional authority, and charismatic authority. I think the example of Gaddafi you used, Gaddafi himself was a very, very charismatic person, not necessarily in the type of a movie star, but I mean, he had an aura around him. People respected Gaddafi for being Gaddafi. And also, I think Western governments are very, very close to becoming new imperial. I really think they're becoming very close to that, because legitimate authority can be granted on various grounds. I think the rational legal authority model, which is the liberal democracies we find these days in the Western world, is just one but such way. And I would remind you that foreign powers such as the United States, France, the UK are very aware of this. If we look at the situation in Saudi Arabia and the United States have a very, very, very close relationship. And the governing structures in Saudi Arabia are completely different to the United States, yet the United States respects them. The United States allows them to continue in their traditional ways. The House of Saudi, or the royal house, gained power in Saudi Arabia, and they've been doing their thing in Saudi Arabia as they see fit. I mean, you cannot have two more polar opposite models, such as the model we find in Saudi Arabia and the model we find in the United States. Yet these two countries respect each other. Their dealings with each other are completely respectful to a certain extent. Let me just correct myself there. To a certain extent, we don't find this situation in Africa. We don't find the respect the Middle Eastern countries such as Iran and the Saudi Arabia, perhaps even Israel, has from the Western world. I believe foreign interference, if I can say this, has resulted in pseudo-African legitimacy. It's very difficult at the moment to distinguish between what is legitimately African and what was imposed upon Africa. I mean, African leaders at the moment, a lot of them, they bank in Switzerland. They have holidays in the Austrian Alps. Are they truly African, or have they been imposed as pseudo-African authorities? That's my question. But to answer you, I do believe that it's entirely possible to respect each other from two different types of authority. If we look at Saudi Arabia with a how can I say it, a religious autocracy, and the United States with a liberal democracy, or even if we say Scandinavian countries, which are more liberal democratic, even more social democratic than the United States, they have respectful and very engaging relationships with countries such as Saudi Arabia. How come African countries aren't granted that exact same respect? I think is the question to be investigated. If if you pose the question to me to get an answer, I am afraid I will have to disappoint you. I do not have an answer, but I really do believe that it has been done, and it is being done currently, where countries with different political, religious, and social models respect each other and are not continuously engaged in unequal exchange. I think the key issue here is that African countries are continuously engaged in unequal exchange from the West. Thank you.
Lisa, just give me one moment, because I want to make a very brief point, and then I'll give you a time to ask the question. I asked specifically, what do you think the role of the international community is? And I find it interesting that despite China's involvement in Africa in general right now, and all of the supposedly development assistance they've been giving, and how much involved they seem to be, you chose to focus on the US, and then you chose to focus on Europe. And I understand that it makes sense because of the colonial past. And it makes perfect sense that the people who, well, originally messed everything up over there will be in the discussion. But to be honest, I was more interested in seeing if Saudi and if China will be mentioned at all. And I was a bit taken aback by how China is not really in the conversation.
I think if I can just say, the reason that I don't entirely focus on China at the moment is because the political models and the political theoretical models employed in Africa at the moment is very Western. We don't see Chinese or Oriental, if I can use the word, excuse if I offend someone, but we don't see Oriental models of political organization, of government structures. We don't see those being employed in Africa at the moment. So from an unequal exchange point of view, you are entirely correct. China is being very, very, very dangerous in Africa at the moment. We've seen them seize port countries in Eastern Africa. But that is not really where my focus at the moment. The conversation is definitely there to be had. And I mean, we can also explore those areas further. The reason why I haven't focused on those is because that the liberal democratic model of governance and state structures with which Africa is being viewed at the moment, and which is currently being exercised in Africa at the moment, is Western. It's not Eastern. If I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Lisa, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Erin, actually, you kind of hit on my point, what I was going to say about, and also building on Tomas's point, where we look at, so, you know, a huge amount of the social services in a lot of African states is provided by international development actors. And for a long time, they were acting upon this idea of basically trying to recreate Western social service structures in African states, which was completely unsuitable, and now are trying to move towards what's called actor-led development. So actually using what's already in place and talking to people already in the country using the services about what they need. And then I was going to relate back to China, again on your point, Erin, where in terms of international development, they're a huge hindrance because they very much don't believe in state building. If you look at their models of international development, it's completely based on them being a client providing services to the government of a country, as opposed to being an actual development aid actor. Also, you know, USAID is not innocent in this as well. They are very, very bad for the pay for aid or trade for aid. situation. So that's what I was kind of point on, is about that international development. We can't ignore it in many African states, because it does, for a long time, built into the Neopatrimonialism. But yeah, I was just wondering what your ideas about these ideas of not so much the international community as in political actors, but the international development actors, because there has been a significant change in terms of the Western actors working towards this actor-led development versus the infringement or the imposition of Western models of development on African countries.
Thank you for your question. I think if I can just quickly get my point in before Thomas answers or gives another question. The welfare state that foreign aid has created in Africa has failed entirely. Foreign aid needs a complete overhaul. I mean, it's completely ineffective. I won't say completely ineffective. It's keeping people alive, which would otherwise be dead, medically, also sustenance-wise, and so on and so forth. But keeping people alive is not enough. Foreign aid has failed to develop these state institutions, which could then be self-reliant. I think in regards to foreign aid, it's an entire different field again than what I'm focusing on here. What I can do or what I have investigated in foreign aid is that how neo-patrimonial practices have adjusted to foreign aid. For example, I think according to the World Bank, 7.5% of foreign aid that has been directed to, I stand corrected, it's either Africa or the entire world, has been found in foreign bank accounts, which means that African political elites or political elites in other countries which receive large amounts of political aid, foreign aid in money-wise, have skimmed the money off the top, and it's being found, literally being found in Swiss bank accounts. So yeah, the model is not, it's not working at the moment. I do believe that, I don't believe the answer is in the West. I believe Africa will provide its own answer. Yeah, if I can be so bold.
Thanks, Ruben. I would like to think about it this way, right? Listening to ex-US President Donald Trump when he addressed African leaders in Washington. He said, I have many of my friends who are going to Africa and they're really, really getting rich. And although that sounds really cynical, but that's absolutely true. These political NGOs or so-called international development organizations are no different, because I think imperialism and to a certain extent, economic control has been institutionalized through development actors. And these development actors are playing agenda setting roles. I think it's completely crazy. Why would USAID or Oxfam or any of these organizations come to Africa with a set agenda? This is what these are the problems of Africa, and this is our agenda. This is how we're going to solve it, without even asking what are the major problems on the ground. I think states themselves should be able to determine what their priorities are, and not these non-governmental organizations pouring money into non-priority sectors and just furthering their own agenda. Because obviously, as you can clearly see, they are being supported by taxpayers' money of foreign countries, even with these non-governmental organizations sponsored by philanthropists. They all have their own personal interests and agenda undermining the democratic structure of Africa. Relating to China, and the reason why we don't talk, China is ripping off Africa. That is true. That's absolutely true. But the reason most African leaders are actually going to China instead of the US is because of the political implication of it. For China, China is pouring billions and billions of dollars into Africa, not interfering in the African political structure, but ensuring that, although it's really unequal, but ensuring that the money they give to Africa is used in terms of projects and the rest of it, cooperating without interfering. But with the case of Western powers, it becomes more destructive. They are not just ripping, but they are destroying the entire political system for their own selfish gain. And this is a problem. Even when people want, you find most Africans who prefer the Beijing consensus or the Washington consensus, for example. Like the entire money given to Zambia, the IMF program on structural reform was totally a mess. It leaves African countries more in debt. You might probably argue that China is keeping African countries in debt, but to a certain extent, they are seeing infrastructure development. They are seeing some very fair relations, although that is questionable, but that is better than having both your political system and your economic system being destroyed by Western imperialists. And the perspective here is that the competition of China and the West in Africa would definitely lead to Africa's development to a certain extent, because China wants to have a hold, China wants to invest in Africa. The US and Euro things is a serious threat to their own power, their extension into Africa. So you find this excessive competition over resources and over a lot of different spheres of the African political affairs, giving Africa like a greater stance in determining how she ought to act, especially when two elephants are fighting on your soil.
Thank you, Thomas. I agree with most of what you said. I would just be very, very, very cautious in not, how can I say this? I think we should be more scared of China than the West at the moment. I don't think China is here with the same intentions as the West, which you are correct in. It's one of those, how would you say, rather the enemy I know than the enemy I don't. So me, myself, I'm very, very cautious of China. I do believe that the main problem of why most African analysts, I can say this, a lot of academic attention is being directed towards the Africa-China issue. However, still, like Aaron rightfully said, a lot of criticism is still directed to the West. And like I said, I believe it's because the West is in Africa with their political model under their arm. West political models in Africa are still being shaped with respect to the Western counterparts. Politically, Africa is not trying to be like China. Politically, Africa is trying to be like the West. Economically, China is very, very dangerous. That's my analysis. I don't know. We'll see in the future. I do believe we'll see in the very near future. We'll see the China issue in Africa being unfolded, but I'll be very careful not being critical towards China as well.
No, Ruben, I wasn't talking about being very receptive to China. I started off by saying China is ripping Africa economically, but I was very blunt in how African leaders perceive China, for example, in the statement of the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, and others, that see China more like a lesser evil than the West. The point here is, even in terms of Africa following more like a liberal democratic model, Africa is trying to relieve herself of the liberal democratic model because it's not fitting Africa. And that's why Kagame himself will talk about sort of consensus democratic model, which is a little different from so-called Western liberal democratic model. That in itself, I think Africa is trying more to get rid of Western structure and everything that has to do with Western governance and focus more on how she can find something that works for her. The reason why most voices, especially from African leaders, have not been heard, because even the colonial structure still perpetuates itself in recreating different leaders and changing the mentality of the people and the rest of it. This is a serious foe that the Africans are fighting. It's not that they've been so receptive to China. The fact here is that they see China more like, to a certain extent, a very good partner to counter Western influence, if we can say that.
Can I perhaps ask? I know it's not normally how these stuff work, but can I perhaps ask you a question? Do you not think perhaps that Africa is being more receptive towards China because China, and if we can perhaps deliver a moral judgment, China is not as morally inclined as the West?
Possibly will not say so. China is very sneaky to a large extent, but I think people are confident dealing with China because China has demonstrated a level of honesty and respect for African political institutions, regardless of whether they like it or not. And this is something that the Africa craves, the right to be respected, the right for whole legitimacy to be respected without any interference. So China is not seen anyway as a dummy or as some sort of moral authority in any way. Africa sees China as a partner she can use in countering Western influence. China is just a tool. You know, the thing about it is that China sees Africa as a new venture to make business and to get money. But Africa also sees China as a tool to counter Western influence and also to ensure that she grows. The problem lies with some corrupt African leaders who can admit, but the fact here is that Africa also sees China as a tool. So it's almost like international politics being played on both sides. Africa is not clear of internal motives. China also is not clear of her own ulterior motives. So these are just two sides of the coin.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe Lisa would like to make a point, make a question.
Yeah, I just want to add on top of that, like similar to what you were saying, China as a development actor, you know, to build on what Tomas was saying, they haven't actually come with this idea. They've come with the idea that they are going to be a trade partner. So where they're doing explicit aid for trade, which is probably a lot more respected because, you know, when you have organizations like USAID and a lot of other international development actors, they came almost like the saviors. We are going to save you. But China hasn't come across that way. China's come across as purely, we are here for business. And I think in that way, it's a lot. I agree that they're incredibly dangerous actors because I'm very aware of how they build their development practices. But to build on what, you know, Thomas was saying, like China's come very, I guess, a lot more upfront about what they actually want. They say they want to be trade partners. Now, this is another version of, we know from Chinese trade, like aid practices, that their projects are what's called dependency projects. So we give you a project and you are going to be completely dependent on us to continue this project. But that's not a whole lot different from really the full history of international development actors, no matter how good they think their intentions are. And that's why I made the point about a lot of organizations moving more towards this, what we call it actor-led development. Maybe, I guess, locally led development is a little bit more well-known, but we don't use that term anymore, where local communities are actually dictating how development projects are undertaken in their communities in Africa, so that way they can actually service the people in the communities the way that they want. But another point to be put on top of that, as interesting as that is, it then still undermines the point of this idea that social services can be given by the state, because now the money is being redirected from the state for the points that was mentioned, where the money is actually getting really put into private bank accounts. So it's interesting that this idea of trying to provide social services that are more beneficial to the people are actually undermining the state as a whole, and still really perpetuating the idea of that, patron-client relationship. The international development actors are there now to serve the communities, which overall seems like a good idea, but it doesn't lead to any further independence.
I completely agree with you, and I'd just like to add that in the midst of all this confusion and underdevelopment and destruction and going on in sub-Saharan Africa, I truly believe that on the ground level, Africans are starting to take accountability. I think myself living in South Africa, I've seen community-led projects where people are sick and tired of the government. People are taking stuff into their own hands, fixing their own roads, delivering their own electricity, their own water, private security, private medicine. So I do believe that the image portrayed from the inside out is not necessarily the reality on the ground. I'm very, even though the presentation was very pessimistic, perhaps it was critical, like a parent should be towards a child, but I'm very optimistic for the future. I think, like you said, agent-led development is really transpiring in Africa at the moment. I see it in Lesotho. I live on a border town. Me myself, I live on the border between South Africa and Lesotho. I see it in Lesotho. I see it in South Africa. I've seen it in Mozambique. I've seen it in Swaziland. I'm not in West Africa. I'm in sub-Saharan, like South Africa. So I mean, I see it happening in Botswana. I see it happening in Namibia. Perhaps the only place where I haven't seen a light is Zimbabwe, but people are taking accountability. They are taking stuff into their own hands. More and more people are inclined to say that, so what? I know the West did this. I know China did this, but so what? What can we do now on the ground to improve our own lives? And I think that's the future.
Lastly, I think I would just like to inject a point very quickly. When the West cries foul about China so much, China is doing this and China is becoming like a danger. You hear that so much from Western leaders. When you think about it from the African perspective, it's the West are telling you got to be careful with China because China is becoming like a real foe and China is endangering Africa. What we can say is the fact that, oh yeah, we recognize that. We think it's important to understand China's motive. But the reason why you are crying foul now, because the road project or probably the real estate project or electricity project in Africa that you were demanding some sort of 60 million in terms of it, China is doing it for less than that, maybe 20 million or whatever, and without any strings attached and the rest of it. So that's the reason why Western leaders are more concerned. It's not that they have more genuine motive and the rest of it. And I've seen so many leaders of for example, look at the case of Cameroon, where the French government will say, oh no, China should not have much stake in Cameroon because they know exactly what they're going for in these African countries. They have no genuine motive. So when they see China coming as a trade partner of Africa, they see China more as a competitor. This is my point. They see China as a competitor. And they do not see the good that China provides to Africa. They only try to highlight the bad it brings to Africa, regardless of the fact that they're even causing more harm to Africa than China. And with actor-led or local community stuff and the rest of it, I think Western manipulation is also playing a huge role. With the rise of this SDG movement and all of that, these are awesome. And I think it's really motivating African youth to get involved in local projects and the rest of it. But most of them have Western undertone. And I think in the long run, it will compromise the future of Africa.
if I can just conclude arguments from my side, I would just like to say that in our debate we've had thus far, I would just like to highlight that Africa has continuously been seen as a place where there's a proxy war between the West and the rest, if I can use that word, the West and the communists, the Western Russia, the Western Soviet Union, the Western China. And I really believe that, as I said earlier, with perhaps Saudi Arabia, it's time for Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in my interest, to become an actor and not a proxy war. I do believe that it's happening slowly but surely. I do believe from ground level up, we'll see a lot of positive revolutions, perhaps not politically, but I mean socially, happen in Africa. I think it's time for Africa to become an actor and not passive in a proxy war between should we accept the money from China or should we accept the money from US aid. We are becoming actors, and I think that's very important in the development sphere also, to that people, especially NGOs and IGOs and foreign governments, start treating African countries, the African continent as a whole, as not a means to an end, but as an end in themselves.
I think that perfectly sums up the entire lecture and perhaps the point that we should keep. Are there any concluding remarks or any final questions by anyone? I don't see anything. Ruben, thank you so much for the presentation and for staying and answering all of the questions, and everyone else for participating in the conversation. I found it very, very interesting, and I really enjoyed the different perspectives that were presented. Thank you for staying and listening to the very end. And Ruben, once again, thank you so much for putting it together.
Thank you for having me, and goodbye.